Professor Subedi, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. Analysts describe the September 2025 uprising as a Generation Z revolution, yet youth mobilization in Nepal has a long genealogy. From your perspective, what specific social, economic, and political configurations enabled this generation to rupture the cycle of elite reproduction where earlier movements failed?
Yeah, thank you so much. And very happy to be here talking to you about protests in Nepal. Well, as you mentioned, Nepal has seen different cycles of revolutions in the past. Particularly, I would like to highlight the two revolutions in the past, peaceful revolutions, which at one point turned violent, which was in 1990 and again in 2006. In between, Nepal also had Maoist revolutions for 10 years, a very violent civil war. But this particular, youth uprising, primarily led by Gen Z youth in Nepal, is actually driven by a number of structural and systemic issues. In fact, the protest started on 7th September, which was directed against what, according to the protesters, it was directed against corruption, elitism, and the lack of, the generational change in politics in Nepal. And these are bigger, much more bigger structural and systemic issues, which are driven by primarily three different interrelated factors. Talking about economic issues, despite Nepal has experienced shifts in political system in the past, and especially in 2015, when the country transformed from constitutional monarchy to a republic, a federal republic in 2015, which was initially, this decision was made in 2008, but then further institutionalized in 2015 by writing a new constitutions in 2015. So that's a massive political shift. But again, when it comes to economic changes, it actually Nepal has a long way to go. Economic development, there is an economic and development stagnations, and the economic institutions which were created and re-strengthened after 2015 constitutions actually did not provide much incentives to the people at large, but especially for the young people, right? So rather, what we have seen in the past at least two decades is that socioeconomic inequalities has deepened in the country. And these economic factors is actually further compounded by political and social factors. And talking about political factors, even though the country has gone through different cycles of democratizations in the past, most major political parties actually lack intra-party democratizations because political leadership has not been handed over to or transferred to younger generations, So there's a lack of intra-party democratizations and the lack of generational shift within the political party. And at the same time, there are also different examples of elite capture, elite dominations of the economic and productive sector, producing what we call cronyism. So Nepal has also experienced a particular form of cronyism that emerged as a nexus between economic elites and political elites recently. And the third, social dimension, is particularly important here in relation to this recent youth revolution, which is, if you look at the demographic figures in Nepal in the past, decades, we can see sort of a youth bulge pattern, which means the number of young people within the demography is growing large. It's a large proportion of populations is young people. So this kind of youth bulge pattern produces vulnerable conditions for revolutions to emerge. So in a nutshell, the economic, social, and political factors which came together and produced a kind of structural conditions and political opportunity structures that on which this recent youth uprising and the revolutions has taken place in Nepal.
Right. Nepal's youth today confront what might be called a triple disjuncture: mass migration, precarious labor markets, and the expansion of the digital public sphere. How do these dynamics intersect to produce a new political subjectivity that resists both elite capture and authoritarian closure?
Look, actually, mass migration and the precarious labor markets are in fact deeply interconnected. These are interconnected, in other contexts as well. But in case of Nepal, the interconnections is much more significant because, and in fact, these are not new issues. Um, at one level, there is also a trade-off, between um, political elites and the people at large, especially young people, when it comes to migration, because political elites saw mass migration as a form of, it's a source of remittance. It's a source of income that people would send by migrating overseas, especially in labor migration. But from political point of view, this has also been a particular type of tactics for social control, because when the young populations is displaced from the country and has moved away, there are only elderly populations and very young populations remaining in the society. That kind of society, from a political point of view, is easy to control, because politicians or political elites, both at national and local level, faces kind of a very less severe sort of political opposition, especially from the young people. This trend has continued for a long time, and as I mentioned earlier, there is also a crony-led economy that grew exponentially in the past few years. But on the part of the young people, for most young people who have migrated, even and working in extreme working conditions in Middle East and elsewhere, for them it's a sort of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, these young people see the overseas employment, labor migration, as a way by which they are able to support their families, they look after their families. But at the same time, there is also a sense of, there's a sense of being missed out in engaging in, social and political activities locally. This was the situations for since 20-25 years, over 2 decades. But then with the rise of social media and the digital platforms, in the age of internet, we have also seen sort of a transnational political activism that has emerged over the time. So now we are in a situations where even if young people are migrated and have been away, they can actually engage in and engage in the discussions about politics of their homelands through social media. So this kind of transnational political activism facilitated by social media platforms has also been a contributing factor to garner, to generate support in favor of youth activism in Nepal. But I mean, you mentioned about the precarious situations. In fact, among the younger generations, there is also this perception that remittance-led economy is very inconsistent. It is not a sustainable thing because it largely depends on the economy of migrants receiving countries as well. So what we have seen recently is that young peoples are much more, interested in exploring opportunities in the country rather than, migrating overseas for short-term or long-term employments. But as a result of that, as I mentioned earlier, the economic conditions in the country has been very precarious because there are lands which have not been cultivated for a long time, especially in the hills and other areas. There are villages where young peoples have also have been absent for a long time. So this is also impacting on the demographic configurations of the country as much as the economic configurations of the country. So again, all of these factors actually contribute to the vulnerability in a sense that among the young people, there is this urgency of both social, political, and economic change in the country. And what we have seen in the protest, September protest, is an expression of that urgency for social change, which the political parties and political elites have failed to deliver so far.
Right. The ban on social media is often cited as the immediate spark of the revolt. Should this be understood as a mere tactical blunder by Oli's government or as symptomatic of a deeper authoritarian reflex embedded within Nepal's ruling elite?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think this is indeed both, on the one hand, it was a what I would say is a tactical blunder of the Oli government because the ban on 26 social media was based on, it was actually based on the miscalculation of possible social and political consequences it could produce. And the reason for this, why it is miscalculations, is because we have seen that it actually drove people, taking to streets in Kathmandu, in fact, across the country. It was blunder tactical move because it failed to foresee what would be the reactions, especially of those younger generation, Gen Z people and other younger generation people who are digital nomads and live in the digital space, because the digital space is their everyday life. And for them, it's not just a space for networking and entertainment, but most recently, it's also been social media platforms are also offering space for political competitions and contestations. So the government actually failed to foresee or predict, the potential political and social backlash and consequences of this, or at least they were probably not ignorant about it, but they just undermine the kind of consequences. But at the same time, this also actually reflects the kind of more sort of a symptom of increasingly authoritarian style of politics of Oli government. One particular example I would like to cite here is that when the social media were banned on 4th of September, then there were news circulating in the social media that was still operating at that time, and I think this was Viber and few other, I guess, where the frustrations of young people was actually voiced through those social media platforms that were active at that time. And there was a call for nationwide protest against the decision by the government. Rather than engaging with the people, especially the younger people, and explaining the population at large why the ban would be necessary, for example, in the words of the government, it would have been necessary for maintaining social cohesion and kind of averting any kind of social fragmentations by misinformations and disinformation circulating in the social media. Well, that could be a good intentioned policy. There's a good intent behind that policy. However, Oli government not only failed to explain this to the people, but at the same time, the ex-prime minister Oli was seen in public actually criticizing and undermining young people's frustration, which is it's a symbolically that actually speaks to his authoritarian position when it comes to use of social media, because for young people it was not just a matter of compliance, but they see it as an attack on their freedom of speech. So in my view, the decision to ban on social media was partly a tactical blunder and partly, a symbolic expression of the increasing authoritarian politics of the ruling elites at that time.
Right. Viral outrage against Nepo babies seems to reflect a moral economy of resentment against elite entitlement. To what extent did the digital spectacle of political heirs flaunting luxury lifestyles crystallize diffuse frustrations into a new form of class politics, distinct from the agrarian and proletarian struggles of earlier eras?
Yeah, look, I think the outrage against Nepo babies, which we have seen in social media for some time in Nepal, but this is also not the case in Nepal. In Asia, we have also seen similar kinds of, outrage against Nepo babies in Indonesia and elsewhere. Philippines is another example. But in the case of Nepal, this is actually a symptom of a deep cultural conflict within Nepal's politics. And it also points to the inequalities and disparities that has grown in between political elites and the ordinary people in the past decades. Of course, Nepo babies are also the symbol of neo-elitism and also growing political culture where that actually endorses elite entitlement and elite resource capture in a country like a resource-poor country like Nepal. In other words, the outrage against Nepo babies or the framing of Nepo babies as a particular type of social class in social media is a symptom of growing socioeconomic inequalities and political divide in the country, which actually also kind of supports a different kind of elitist political culture. Well, people didn't expect when there was a massive political change in 2015, which I mentioned earlier. You can actually, to put that into context, when the Maoist called for a revolutions in armed revolutions in 1996, in the last during the 10 years of the insurgency, 17,000 people died. They were killed in the insurgency. There are many hundreds, even thousands are still disappeared, and there are thousands and thousands of families that have been disintegrated or displaced because of the insurgency. There are also ex-combatants who actively fight it in the war from Maoist side, but also from the government side, now are living their life with disability, and they carry deep emotional and psychological distress, which they inherited from the war. And the memory about the precarious time, very insecure time of war hasn't faded away. And among Nepalese society, this is not a very distant thing in the history. And the society, the Nepalese society is very much aware of what people sacrificed, not just of those who fought in the war, but also the ordinary people who sacrificed during the Maoist insurgency. And then there was a political shift in 2008 and 2015. But now you can actually contrast these situations with the children of political elites, politicians, who are now uh, living a luxurious life, and most importantly, showing their luxurious life, lavish life, and the privileges in social media. That kind of contrasting scenario is obviously going to be outrageous for a group of people who feel that they have they have lost a decade in their life because of the insurgencies, and that there are few opportunities available for the masses of the people. What we have seen in the recent revolutions is the clash of those two types of political cultures, and the kind of life people are living, which are very, very contrasting. That's why young people have actually shown their frustrations against nepo babies. But again, nepo babies is a product of the bad political culture, rising neo-elitism, and then the institution failure to bring about equitable socioeconomic change and transformations in the country.
Right. Nepal is the third South Asian country in 4 years to witness mass youth-led uprisings, after Sri Lanka in 2022 and Bangladesh in 2024. What do you see as the common drivers across these cases, and what is unique to Nepal's trajectory?
Uh, Look, actually, the common there are like several common drivers. Uh, One of the common thing is that in all three revolutions, there is an overwhelming involvement and participation of young people, especially in Bangladesh and Nepal. We have seen, the generous Gen Z people have been involved in this kind of protest movement. In Sri Lanka, in Aragalaya, it was a bit different because there were people coming from three different ethnic groups: Tamil, Sinhalese, and Muslims, who came together. This was also mostly led by young people, but also people from other generations were involved in the revolutions that toppled the government of Rajapakses. And there are contextual differences as well, differences in terms of politics, history, and so on and so forth. But then there are common structural issues which are behind the rise of this kind of movements in the three countries. And at the center of that structural inequality, structural issue, is the perception of injustice. Okay, in Sri Lanka, the Aragalaya movement was mostly fueled by, it was driven by the government's failure, economic collapse, and the government's failure to manage the economy, when the country transitions from decades of civil war to peace and stability. In Bangladesh, this was directed towards a bad government policy by Sheikh Hasina's government when it comes to, providing, securing quota in government jobs, offering jobs to young people. So it was actually directed to a particular kind of policy. And in Nepal, this was actually triggered by another kind of policy decision, which was triggered by the ban on social media. Regardless of all these three trigger factors, what we have seen is that growing socioeconomic inequality, lack of generational change in politics, the perception of young people, but also the reality of the young people's sense of socioeconomic exclusion, relative deprivations, and the frustration towards increasingly growing elitist types of politics. These are the kind of common issues we can see in all three different countries. And then the young people, at the same time, when these three different types of issues converge in motivating young people to take to the street, social media played an important role as a facilitator of this kind of collective movement.
Right. In Sri Lanka, the Aragalaya protest movement toppled Rajapaksa's, but was quickly reabsorbed into elite politics. What lessons should Nepali youth learn from Sri Lankan experience to avoid repeating the cycle of betrayal?
Well, Sri Lanka's case is probably slightly also different from the case of Nepal, particularly, when it comes to the transfer of political authority at the end of the revolutions. Uh, there is now a new government which came to power after the elections, and there is a progressive government which is different from the previous populist nationalist government of Rajapaksa. So what we have seen in Sri Lanka is a very quick and a pretty smooth transfer of power from the previous regime to the new progressive government, and which, as we can see in the recent elections, has received a overwhelming mandate by the Sri Lankan people. So the transitions was less. Of course, it was fragile, but the Sri Lankans managed it very well in terms of shifting power from previous regime to the new one. In case of Nepal, now we have a civil society government, a kind of pattern which is more or less similar to what we have seen in Bangladesh, after the 2024 revolutions. Now, this civilian government has given a mandate to hold elections within 6 months, and now there's a government headed by the former Chief Justice in the country. Her name is Susila Karki. So Nepal actually can learn a few things here from Sri Lanka. One is that it will be always in the best interest of the people and the political systems to manage these transitions and make it as short as possible, because a proper handover of power from previous governments to the next elected government is a key here. In the meantime, there are also additional challenges for the Nepalese government currently, the civilian government in power at the moment. But also, Nepal also has the challenge to, make those people in power from the previous governments who are accountable to the loss of life during the protest movement. Proper investigations into the abuse of power, coercion by the previous regimes is a challenging issue, but that needs to be addressed. But at the same time, there are also a lot of public frustrations and anger about the corruption cases. There are dozens of corruption cases in the past from as early as 1990s, which have not been properly investigated. And political power have been misused, and abused to avoid investigations of those cases. So the civilian government in power at the moment has a lot of challenges, but the main lessons it could learn from Sri Lanka in particular is to ensure that there is a process mechanisms and systems in place to transform power from previous authorities to a newly elected authorities.
Right. In Bangladesh, the fall of Sheikh Hasina has opened space for religious extremism and new forms of repression. How should we understand the dangers of authoritarian populists exploiting anti-corruption or anti-elitist discourses in fragile democracies?
Well, that's a very good question. And Nepal also has, I wouldn't say a real possibility, but there may be, there may be some sort of, scenario when certain forces within the politics, either existing or emerging, might use populist rhetorics to exploit the fluid situations in the transitional period. In other words, there may be risks of populist nationalist kinds of political narratives, being circulated as a mainstream narratives in the meantime and taken over, the post-revolutions political system. The risks are always there. In Bangladesh, we have seen some kinds of religious extremist narratives have been circulating in the political domain and influencing, politics, and this is typical of Bangladesh because of its, sociocultural and socio-religious configurations of the country. In case of Nepal, there are two kind of potential scenario where if any populist forces seek to exploit the situations can emerge, in my view. One is that there is probably a less risk about a kind of a right-wing populist politics that can exploit culture or ethnicity, to advance populist political agendas in Nepal, because Nepal is ethnically a diverse country, and if any populist forces emerges at this stage, one possibility that it might actually mobilize people across ethnic divide. So in that sense, it might look less right-wing populist we have seen elsewhere. But at the same time, the other bigger risk is that Nepal was the only Hindu country in the world until 2015. So when the new constitutions was passed in 2015, since then it has become a secular country. And even though it's a secular country, it's a weakly secular country because in practice, in everyday life for people, religion is still it still presents in the public domain. It's not actually have been retracted to the private domain. And as a result of that, there are certain political parties and also interest group which want to reinstate the Hindu states in Nepal, and that's another risk where it may be there may be a sort of a potential that a populist kinds of politics that might emerge in this transition, mobilizing and exploiting on uh, religious factors, religious narratives, and religious ideologies. And if that happens, that sort of populist politics might be more dangerous because then it actually it might share certain elements of right-wing populism we have seen elsewhere, because that would be sort of a religious populism in Nepal. So yeah, like Sri Lanka, Nepal also has a risk, but at the same time, it also has got opportunity because the elections has been called in 6 months' time, and if elections happens and if there's a smooth transition of power, then the Nepali, the societies might be able to navigate these challenges in the days to come.
Right. And finally, Professor Subedi, do you see in Nepal's Generation Z uprising the embryonic forms of a post-elitist democracy, an order rooted not in patronage or coercion, but in participatory, inclusive politics? Or does the violence of the moment suggest that the path forward remains perilously uncertain?
Well, at the moment, it's I would say I would like to be optimistic, about your questions, and I would say there are signs of post-elitist kind of uh, politics to emerge in this case. But again, a lot depends on what kind of political institutions will it consolidate in the days to come. Uh, Looking at the past, one of the major challenges in case of Nepal is that even though there was political change, political shift back in 2015, 2008, and even before, the the change in institutional setup actually did not result in meaningful socioeconomic transformation. And one of the reasons why it didn't happen is because institution changed, but institutional culture inherited from the past essentially remained the same. So as a result of that, corruption continued, exclusions continued, and people's frustrations against the system and political elites deepened. So in these situations, I think how the young generation's voice can be institutionalized and can be established in the mainstream politics in the days to come will determine a lot. But I would see this change in a much more optimistic way rather than in a pessimistic way, because despite some losses, there has been destructions, violence when the protest intensified in day two. Despite all this loss, there is a sense of there is a sort of a awareness and sense that we can see among the public is that change was inevitable, change was necessary, and we have come to the time where much more meaningful change, both in terms of political institutions, system of governance, political participation, uh, is necessary, but changing political culture is also necessary. And I think if more and more young people are able to participate in politics, they I would say that they might be able to contribute to fostering a political culture which is much more participatory, inclusive, and can set up systems, economic systems, but also political systems that are fair, inclusive, and can bring about change as desired by those who sacrificed their lives, but also those who participated in these protest movements. So a lot depends on how the state will and the society will navigate this challenge and crisis, because sometimes past history also gives us a clue to predict the future. Unfortunately, the past record of how Nepalese societies navigated post-revolutions political space is not very encouraging, as I said earlier. But this time, because the revolutions was led by particularly young people outside of the political parties participation, it was not hierarchical as would have been the case if it were led by political parties. But at the same time, it was even though it was a leaderless movement, it very quickly showed some results, some consequences. So the kind of public support this protest movement has received is unprecedented. Okay, in that sense. So there's huge public support, and in fact, that kind of public support is also a good indicator of the legitimacy of current government, and also the government which will take over the power when power is handed over to elected government. So that kind of legitimacy provides is good for any government and any political leaders who come to power with a good intention to bring about meaningful social, economic, and political change. And that's what we can hope at this stage. But a lot depends on how this will be managed, how the society will navigate through this.
Professor Subedi, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you too.